Welcome to a new video series we're going to have on the channel. It's all about learning leadership from different places than you might think, like movies, TV shows, video games, etc. Normally, we learn leadership from like books or TED Talks or conferences or things like that, but we're going to look in different areas. I'm Josh, and this channel is dedicated to the convergence of tech, leadership, gaming, and life. Today, we're going to answer the question, can you learn leadership from Skyrim? For those of you well-versed in leadership topics, you're thinking, learning leadership from a video game? I don't know if you can do that. And for those of you well-versed in gaming, you might be thinking, wait, Skyrim? That's a 10-year-old game. What can you learn from the buggy mess it can be? Both are really valid questions. But, one, I have way too much Skyrim lore stuck in my head for this to go to waste. And two, I think we'll all learn something in this video and series. So to do this, we can't go through every single character in Skyrim. That would take way too long. Nor are we going to talk much about the history of Skyrim. You don't need to know much about the Great War or how the Nords settled in the province of Skyrim or what happened to the Snow Elves or the Dwemer or all these kinds of things. You don't need to know all that. There's a lot to unpack and a lot to learn in the lore, but you don't really need to know any of that if you're just playing the game. So instead, we're just going to focus on one level of leadership, and that's positional leadership. And each different region is called a different hold. And there's a Jarl dedicated to governing the hold. This won't be a simple ranking of who's the best Jarl in Skyrim, because that's a pretty easy list and quick answer to make in a video that we're not going to focus on today. Instead, we're just going to focus on the normal interaction and conversations you have with these characters. So let's take a look at the Jarls and see if there's anything we can learn from them. Now bear in mind, we're not going through every person who has the potential to become a Jarl, otherwise this video is going to be twice as long. We start our journey in Winterhold, which is one of the northernmost regions of Skyrim. Jarl Career is the leader of that hold. Now, he is very disapproving of the local college of Winterhold. Now, that is the college where you can go and learn about magic and spellcasting and things like that. He's convinced that the mages are the reason that Winterhold isn't really viewed as one of the best holds in Skyrim. And he's not necessarily wrong. A couple hundred years in the game's past, there was something called the Great Collapse, which was a pretty bad earthquake that destroyed a lot of Winterhold and caused it to fall into the sea. And the College of Winterhold was mostly unaffected, except for the bridge that connects it to the mainland that really should have fallen down, structurally speaking, but was probably held up by magic. But we're not going to get into conspiracy theories here because there's enough of that in the game. But when all's said and done, though, Career doesn't do much other than sit around and gripe about how bad Winterhold is because of the mages. And that really has an impact on his son. So he's not really setting up the next generation for success, and rather he's just kind of sitting and wallowing in what he's inherited as Jarl instead of getting up and doing something about it. Because he has the power to do something about it, but he kind of just doesn't. One notable thing that he wants to do is get Winterhold back as one of the more prominent holds in Skyrim, like it was hundreds of years ago. The way he does that is he tasks the player on going and getting an item that he thinks will, help Winterhold be viewed as prominent. He doesn't really do much other than that. So there's not a ton we can learn from Jarl Career of Winterhold, so let's move on. Let's go to Fallhold, which is one of the southernmost regions. And the Jarl, the leader of Fallhold, his name's Sigurd. He's one we can kind of gloss over because he doesn't have much to do with this hold. He sees his position as one where you can do whatever you want, eat whatever you want, go hunting with all the best, dogs and things like that. That's something that he says. But he doesn't actually do anything. His steward, and he admits it himself, his steward is the one that takes care of everything, and he just takes the advantage of being the Jarl. There's not really much good we can learn from Sigurd. And even worse, he admits to having some shady dealings with some bandits in the area, and he tasks the player, you, as going to be his own personal cleaner, as it were, so people don't find out that he's been doing some, shady under the table kind of stuff. Let's move on. The next one we're going to look at is Jarl Idgrod Ravencrone. What a name. She's the leader of Morthal, and she's interesting, to say the least. She's supposed to be this incredibly wise person, and yet you can't really escape the feeling that she talks to you and everyone else from a place of I'm above you, and I'm talking down to you, very down to you kind of thing. She has dealings with the wizard that moved into the town recently, and also Side note, that wizard is the only person that can cure you from being a vampire if you become one, but I digress. The whole situation feels a little suspicious, to say the least, and Idgrod is well aware that people in her town are afraid of the wizard and her dealings with him. She even knows that her own son is having nightmares at night and waking up very afraid, screaming out the wizard's name. Red flag. But she doesn't do anything about it. She makes no effort to quell people's fears, and she just kind of sits around. She doesn't do anything. She just sits and talks wearily about some ominous, vague threat that's coming to Skyrim and Morthal, and she goes on about her gift of having visions and things like that, but she doesn't do anything about it. All the wisdom in the world is useless if you don't actually apply it to anything. So we have another Jarl who kind of just sits around doing nothing all day. I'm kind of afraid of the pattern that we're seeing develop here, but let's move on and see what we can learn from the other ones. The Jarl of Dawnstar is Skald the Elder, and Skald is... he's not great. He's stubborn, he's sour, and he's pretty eager to kill anyone that sides with the Empire during the game's Civil War storyline. There's a lot that could be said about Skald the Elder, but I think what sums it up best is that he treats everyone in his own court with disdain and terrible double standards. One person wants to go and fight in the Civil War for the side that Skald is vehemently for, and he laughs him off. And, on top of that, he sends out too many of Dawnstar's own guards to go and fight on the front lines of the war. And he won't let one of his servants, who's not native to Skyrim, leave to go home because they don't want to fight in the Civil War. He demands that they stay. There's not a lot of good we can learn from Skald the Elder, so let's move on. Lelia Lawgiver is the Jarl of Riften, and she is not in control of Riften at all. She believes that she has the Thieves Guild under control. She doesn't. It is not under control at all. It grows really well under her nose. And there are citizens that show power and control over her, even though she's supposed to be the leader of the hold. One person is Maven Blackbriar, who runs the local meadery and is incredibly wealthy and influential in that she has a lot of money and people just kind of do what she says. So Lelia, there's not really a lot of good we can learn. It's also rough on her record when, in the context of a possible dragon attack, she has this to say. If Riften should fall, it's only fitting that its leader be spared. Nope, that's not good. So, let's keep going. Jarl Igmund, which don't confuse with Idgrod, like I did in the research for this video, is the leader and Jarl of Markarth and the greater area called the Reach. The city of Markarth has a lot to deal with. There's Skyrim's Civil War that started in Markarth, and there's a group of rebels called the Forsworn that have leached their way into the city because they want to take over the whole Reach and countryside and everything. There's a lot that Igmund has to deal with. The Civil War started because of decisions that he himself made. That's a rough place to be. But he's the one that sowed the seed of the situation that he's currently in. There's a lot more to the layered complexity of Markarth and the whole Forsworn conspiracy and everything. But there is actually one lesson we can learn here, leadership-wise. You reap what you sow. Let's move on. Elys the Fair is the Jarl of Solitude, one of the biggest cities in Skyrim. Elys is the widow of the former High King of Skyrim, named Torrig. She doesn't have a ton of experience as Jarl and trusts the Imperial General, whose name's Tullius, to, kind of taking care of the Civil War problem and just informing her on what's going on while she tries to lead the city. She is a really interesting character, but there's not really much leadership-wise we can learn from her. Here we move to Windhelm, and the Jarl of Windhelm is named Ulfric Stormcloak. He is one of the biggest characters in the game, and he is the leader of the city of Windhelm. But he's also the leader of the Stormcloak Rebellion, which is the whole reason, he is the whole reason for the entire Civil War in Skyrim. He's actually one of the first characters you meet in the game. You, him, and a group of other people have been captured by the Empire and are on their chopping block until a dragon shows up. If you go visit him in Windhelm, he won't talk to you much, but he does give a pretty fervent speech about why Skyrim should be out from under Imperial control and be its own independent sovereign nation. His reasoning does make a bit of sense. He went through the whole Great War and everything and saw some pretty horrific things, and he was even prisoner for a while and went through some pretty terrible ordeals. That being said, the leadership of his city is squarely on his shoulders, and it's not great. It's very easy to see that The Nords are put first, and anyone that's not a Nord is viewed as second class. He is a complex character for sure, but there's not a lot of good stuff leadership-wise that you can learn from him, other than how to start an uprising, or how to take great nicknames, because his nickname is the Bear of Markarth, and that's dope. But he also looks at anyone who doesn't fully support him as kind of an enemy. So again, not really much we can learn from him. And I'm afraid we're not really learning much as we walk through this. But let's move on to our last Jarl. Balgruff the Greater is the Jarl of Whiterun. He's the last on our list of Jarls, and probably the best. He tries to stay out of the Civil War, and is vehemently neutral until it's found out that an attack is going to take place on Whiterun from the Stormcloaks. Then he takes a side with the Empire, but only because he has to. He's actually one of the only Jarls that has influence with all of Skyrim, with all the other Jarls. And that's an important point, because a lot of the other Jarls don't really have influence with anyone else. But Balgruff rises above that and has influence with almost everyone else in the entire province of Skyrim. We do see a lot more of Balgruff than any other Jarl, because he's one of the most prominent figures in the entire storyline and the main questline of the game. He's not afraid to defend his people and take action when provoked. Whiterun is kind of seen as one of the crown jewels of Skyrim, and for good reason. Its central location, deep history with the people of Skyrim, and plenty of farmland surrounding it makes it a pretty wonderful place to be. At least some of that probably has to do with Balgruff's leadership, right? Well, probably. But when looking at what we can learn from his leadership, there's not much we can actually take away. In fact, it's hard to know if there's anything good leadership-wise we can learn from any of the Jarls. Nearly all of them only get up from their thrones to go to bed, or sit in on a council meeting, or talk war tactics. You don't see them interact with a lot of people outside their inner circle, and for a few of them, they don't care much about the people in their hold. They just care about the title. This brings us back to the idea of positional leadership that we talked about a few weeks ago, rather than developing people and working at a higher level. Some of this has to do with the culture of Skyrim. It's very historical. It's very focused on the past and ancestors and things like that. And the Nords of Skyrim can be a little resistant to change. And the title of Jarl seems to be something that is kind of just handed down generationally instead of to the best person for the job at that moment. So we've gone through this journey and learned one thing about leadership and really just life in general, the whole reap what you sow kind of thing. Sort of. But the interaction that you have with the Jarls and with almost every person in the game brings us to a really important point. There's one person that we haven't looked at. You. The player character is actually one of the best examples of potential leadership in the entire game. How's that? Well, in every region, the more that you help people and talk to them and get to know them, you actually become Thane of that hold. Thane is an honorary title, and it just means that this is a person of influence in the hold. And that's leadership. Leadership is influence. And so that you becoming Thane is you going around gaining influence with others. And gaining influence so much that you're seen as a leader in the hold just because you are there for people and help them out with whether it be an everyday task or clearing out a bandit cave or whatever. And that even extends to the guards who won't stop you for certain things if they know that you're the Thane. This idea of potential leadership goes into each faction that you become a part of, where you can become leader of things like the Thieves Guild just by gaining influence with the members so much that when it's time to pick a new leader, they look to you and you alone. So if we're looking to learn leadership from Skyrim, you don't actually have to go that far. You just have to look at the potential influence that you have with each and every character. This is how we can learn leadership from Skyrim, is that you have the ability to gain influence with some of the most powerful characters in the game. The question is, how are you going to use that influence? This applies to your own life as well. You have the ability to gain influence with others. The question is, how are you going to use that influence? I don't know about you, but I'm going to go play Skyrim for the 100th time. And when I play, I'm going to look at the influence that I gain with people and use that influence for the good of those around me. So if you like this video, click the like button. We're going to have more videos in this series coming down the line on the channel, so subscribe to make sure you don't miss them. There are more videos here on the channel of leadership and tech, so go check them out. Leave a comment on what you want to see in this series, or who's your favorite character in Skyrim. I hope this video is giving you some perspective and some ideas for the next time you play Skyrim, or any RPG for that matter. And I'll see you guys next week in the next video.